generations have cared for the lands they call home. We are here to discuss the findings of 6 reports that my office released this morning. This release also includes a message to mark the halfway point of my 10-year mandate as Auditor General of Canada. Je vais me pencher en premier sur notre audit des centres de communication de l'Agence du revenu du Canada. Cet audit visait à déterminer si les centres fournissent aux Canadiennes et Canadiens des renseignements exacts et opportuns au sujet de leurs impôts personnels, des prestations et de l'impôt des entreprises. L'Agence du revenu du Canada a le devoir d'aider les particuliers et les entreprises à s'acquitter de leurs obligations fiscales et à se prévaloir de prestations. Je crains que malgré un nouveau système de téléphonie et d'autres améliorations, les Canadiennes et Canadiens attendent encore trop longtemps pour obtenir des réponses à leurs questions sur l'impôt. Au cours du dernier exercice, les contribuables qui ont voulu parler avec une agente ou un agent ont attendu en moyenne 31 minutes, soit 2 fois plus long que la norme de service de 15 minutes de l'agence. De plus,
when callers did reach an agent, they were often provided with inaccurate information.
auditors from my office placed calls to contact centers and asked general or non-account specific questions. We found that agents' responses to individual tax questions were accurate only 17% of the time, and business tax or benefit questions were accurate just only half of the time. To test the accuracy of agents' responses to account-specific questions, we reviewed a sample of recorded conversations. We found that the accuracy was much higher when questions pertained to specific accounts. Turning now to our 2 audits of programs related to the Canadian Armed Forces. The first focused on whether the forces recruited and trained enough members to meet operational requirements. Between 2022 and 2025, the Canadian Armed Forces fell short of its target by about 4,700 recruits. Though the forces were able to attract thousands of applicants, only 1 in 13 started basic training. Les forces ne savaient pas toujours pourquoi
The Canadian Armed Forces did not always know why applicants abandoned the recruitment process. Without this information, the Canadian Forces are not able to determine what needs to be done differently to increase the number of successful candidates. The Armed Forces also did not have sufficient basic training capacity to meet demand if the recruitment targets had been met. Challenges attracting and training enough highly skilled recruits to staff many occupations, such as pilots and ammunition technicians, could affect the Army, Navy, and Air Force's ability to respond to threats, emergencies, or conflicts and accomplish their missions.
Our second audit relating to the Canada's military force focused on housing. Overall, we found that National Defence did not manage living accommodations to meet operational requirements or to respond to the needs of Canadian Armed Forces members and their families. National Defence did not have enough living spaces at the right locations, including quarters that met its own standard for living space per person. We also found that some buildings were in poor condition, lacking basic amenities such as safe drinking water or working toilets. De plus, l'Agence de logement.
In addition, the Canadian Forces Housing Agency, which manages residential housing units on bases, did not plan to build enough new housing units to fill existing gaps. Canadian Armed Forces members can be required to move frequently. It is important for their morale and well-being that they can access affordable housing in good condition, with sufficient living space for themselves and their families.
Notre prochain a dit
Our next audit examined whether the federal government had the tools in place to protect its IT networks and systems against cyber attacks. While the government did have a comprehensive strategy, there were gaps in some areas such as cybersecurity defense services, and response during active cyber attacks.
58% of federal organizations are not required to use the cybersecurity defense services offered by Shared Services Canada and the Communications Security Establishment Canada. Though some have opted in, this inconsistent use of services has resulted in a fragmented cybersecurity landscape that could undermine the federal government's ability to protect critical information and manage risks. We also found coordination among the Treasury Board of Canada Secretariat, the Communications Security Establishment Canada, and Shared Service Canada was too slow during active cyber attacks. Slow coordination and limited information sharing during a recent major attack delayed the government's response, extending time during which the attacker had access to public servants' personal information. Malicious actions, external events, and attacks involving the Canadian government's digital systems are becoming more sophisticated and more frequent. Une approche coordonnée.
A coordinated and comprehensive approach to the government's cybersecurity posture, better collaboration, and a current inventory of IT assets are key to safeguarding Canadians' information and their trust in government IT systems. Our next audit looked at whether Employment and Social Development Canada fulfilled its responsibilities to support early learning and childcare across Canada. The federal government committed $35 billion to provinces, territories, and Indigenous partners over 5 years in order to support the creation of affordable and accessible childcare spaces. As of March 2024, parents' out-of-pocket fees for federally funded spaces had been reduced to an average of about $16.50 a day.
Funding also supported the creation of approximately 112,000 new childcare spaces as of March 2024. However, with less than 2 years left, there is a risk that the goal of creating 250,000 spaces by 2026 will not be met. Important progress has been made in bringing down childcare costs to parents. However, Employment and Social Development Canada needs to collect consistent and comparable data across the country to track the program's overall performance, inform future decisions, and support Canadian families. Dans notre dernier audit,
Our final audit is a follow-up that examined Indigenous Services Canada's progress to address 34 recommendations from 6 audits conducted since 2015. Programs to First Nations is a decades-long concern for my office. Despite the almost doubling Indigenous Services Canada's spending on programs over the last 5 years, we found unsatisfactory progress on more than half of recommendations to address long-standing issues critical to the health and well-being of First Nations communities. 20 years after my office first identified concerns with drinking water quality in First Nations communities, 35 long-term advisories remain in effect, including 9 that have been in place for a decade or longer.
our audit also found there were fewer emergency services agreements in place than in 2022. These agreements are essential for timely coordinated responses to events such as wildfires and floods, while mitigating the disruption to people's lives and damage to critical infrastructure. Sustained focus from Indigenous Services Canada to rethink how it delivers programs, while collaborating with First Nations to improve their capacity, is an important step to resolving these persistent issues, improve outcomes, and advance reconciliation. As I look ahead to the second half of my mandate, my unwavering goal remains that my office will continue to provide nonpartisan, fact-based information to parliamentarians and the federal public service so that they can move more easily to adjust and best direct resources towards outcomes that serve the diverse needs of Canada's peoples. The intention is to be constructive and focused on the pursuit of excellence and accountability for the public service. This has been the focus of my first 5 years leading the Office of the Auditor General of Canada, and it will continue to be the focus for the next 5. Merci, thank you. I'm now ready to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. Okay, we'll now turn to the questions. One question and one follow-up per reporter. We'll start with Rachel Haynes, CTV.
Thank you, and thank you for taking our questions today. I wanted to start about your reports with the military recruitment and military housing. Are you concerned about DND's and the Canadian Armed Forces' ability to responsibly manage the billions in new funding that they're receiving, given what you've pointed out in your reports?
I think my 2 reports today highlighted that the Canadian Armed Forces isn't recruiting enough members when only 1 in 13 who apply, and there are thousands who apply, only make it to basic training. And then they don't have enough housing for them. So this is going to impact retention. I would imagine that some of the new funding will get devoted to some of these initiatives. Some of the funding will be used, as we've heard, for increased salaries, which should help with retention. But what I think these 2 reports point out, linked to funding, is that while national defense has lots of plans, a lot of it is based on outdated information. And so if you need an accurate idea of how much you need to spend, whether it be to build or renovate buildings, or how much you need to spend to recruit more members, you should be using up-to-date information, and you should be updating that on a regular basis.
Great, thank you. And my next question is about your report on the CRA call centers. The Office of the Auditor General has looked at the CRA call centers in the past. So what more can you say to get the government to take this seriously? I mean, we're looking at only answers being accurate 17% of the time. That's quite low. So what more can you say to the government? Is there one word that you'd use to describe this to get their attention on this issue?
Oh, I don't know if I would describe it for CRA, but I would describe it for Canadians, that I can appreciate the frustration in trying to reach an agent at the Canada Revenue Agency. Waiting twice as long as last year, or on average 31 minutes, is a long time to wait. And then only if you're asking about a personal income tax question or a general one, you're unlikely to get an accurate response. You're correct. In 2017, we did look at the Canada Revenue Agency, which is why we followed up to see whether they had improved on accuracy and timeliness. While there have been some improvements over time, the fact that now calls are being recorded allowed us to actually triage the kind of testing that we did. And when a call was about something specific related to your account, when will my tax return be assessed? When can I expect to receive a GST return? You were getting accurate responses. But it was when you called to ask general questions. So, for example, a member of my family passed away in December. When should I file their tax return? That kind of information was inaccurate. And in a system where Canadians have to voluntarily fill out their tax returns, I think they should expect to reach CRA and get accurate information when they talk to an agent.
Okay, Jillian Piper, Global.
Thanks for taking questions. Just building on your last point there, you mentioned some Canadians do have to file their own tax returns. The government recently promised that for some low-income Canadians, they'll be enrolled in automatic tax filing. Do you think that will have an impact on the accessibility or the efficiency of the CRA?
So under Canada's current system, every taxpayer, you and me, and anyone else, has the onus of providing their tax return on time and making sure that it has accurate information. So I think the change that's being brought about should hopefully improve access to benefits. Many of the benefits in the Canadian tax system are only accessible if you file an income tax return. We saw that during the pandemic. We see that with childcare benefits. So I hope it will improve access to those benefits. But when it comes to calling the Canada Revenue Agency and getting an accurate answer, I think there's lots of opportunities to improve here, whether it be the tools that agents have or triaging calls that are about how do I get into my account versus help me with a tax question. I think that they could then better train the agents to respond.
And just to follow up, I know you mentioned you've been looking at this for years. What do you think is the biggest barrier to improvement here? You mentioned training there, but what is stopping us from taking those measures and going the next step to improve things?
I don't think I can speak about the whole time between 2017 and now, but I can speak about the few years that we did look at. I think some of the tools that are available to agents are not helping them be more efficient. So once you reach an agent, the average call is about 17 minutes, but about more than 20% of that time is spent on hold as an agent looks for an answer. So making sure that agents are better equipped with tools and have some better training. I think some of it could also be tied to the fact that an agent's annual performance review has a very limited amount of time devoted to the accuracy and completeness of the responses they give. Less than 10% of their annual evaluation is linked to that. Most of it's focused on meeting a schedule or call volume, and that doesn't create the culture where accurate responses is top of mind. So I think there's some opportunity to change the approach, but then also the tools.
Okay. Yasmine Meri, Radio-Canada.
I have a similar question regarding the CRA. When we're talking about inaccurate information given to taxpayers, what can the impact be on taxpayers? What can be done to improve the situation? Answer: I believe that in Canada, all taxpayers must send in their tax returns to the CRA with accurate information. And so when you call the CRA, the expectation is to have a response that is also accurate. But when there is information that is inaccurate, it can lead to errors in filing taxes as an individual or for a business, and that can lead to negative impact. And so I would expect the CRA to improve access to their agents, but also improve the tools that the agents have so that they can give out better and accurate information. Is there a link between reducing the number of agents and the quality of service? Answer: I believe that the number of agents answering calls has an impact on the quality, but so do the tools being used. The CRA could improve its services by changing the tools being used or by following some of our recommendations in order to filter calls. If it's a technical question, if somebody's having access issues, it's a different training required than a more specific tax-related question. Did you see an openness on behalf of the CRA? Well, the CRA agrees with our recommendations. I believe that they found some of them to be easy to implement. They agreed with our recommendations in 2017 as well, though. So I think a lot of improvements can be made.
CBC News.
Hi, thank you. Uh, Your report on military housing found that quarters were often in poor condition and well below the standards that the forces have set out. Can you maybe paint a picture and provide some more detail on what exactly did maybe you see when touring those houses, if you did, or your team?
Mhm. Members of my audit team actually visited 3 bases. And so we were able to look at the 45 buildings that were on these bases. And I could tell you the average age was over 60 years old. In fact, one building was built in 1930. We then looked at buildings that identified that they needed repair. So there was 32 out of 35 of the buildings that needed at least one high priority repair. And so what would that look like? Well, that might mean that that building didn't have safe drinking water. So there was improvements needed to the drinking system. Toilets weren't working, or there was structural damage to the exterior walls of the buildings. The kind of conditions that you and I wouldn't want to live in, and the kind of conditions I don't think we should expect members of our Canadian Armed Forces to live in.
On the CRA report, obviously you looked at call centers in the past in 2017. I just I don't want to misrepresent 2017 report and today's report, but is it fair to say things are far worse in terms of call wait times and other things? And if they are, just can you walk us through what are the things specifically that are far worse?
It's a real hard comparison to do, I think, between 2017 and today, because there have been some improvements, and then there are things that are worse. So back in 2017, the call wait time, or the expectation was that 80% of the calls would be answered in 2 minutes. That was changed, and now it's 65% of the calls in 15 minutes. Regardless of what the service standard is, people are waiting on average 31 minutes. So it's twice as long as they waited just last year. And in fact, in June of 2025, less than 5% of calls made it through in the service standard. So there's clearly an opportunity to improve that. But when it comes to the accuracy of information given, I think this is where there's been an improvement. The Canada Revenue Agency's phone system allowed recording of calls, which we weren't able to listen to back in 2017. And so that allowed us to really differentiate if you were calling about something really specific about you, that it was chances are you would get a better answer, like over 80% of those answers were accurate. But when you were calling for general information, that's where the accuracy fell to only 17% for personal tax questions and a little bit over 50% if you were calling about businesses or benefits.
Okay, Natasha Belowski at Canada's National Observer.
Hi, yeah, thanks for taking our questions. I'll be asking about the report following up on programs for First Nations, specifically the emergency management section. So it says that Indigenous Services Canada used to have 6 emergency service agreements and 6 wildfire response agreements with different provinces. But now you write that those numbers are at 4 and 5, respectively. What went wrong? Like, why is there now less agreements than the last time this was looked at?
So I think here is mostly that agreements expired. And when they expired, you would hope that someone would continue to honor them, but you don't have a signed agreement in place. Many of the existing agreements that we had identified in 2022 were just bilateral agreements between the federal government and Indigenous service and the First Nations community. But now the goal is to try and have bilateral or trilateral where the provinces are involved. So I think that's why they let some agreements expire, because they want to move to trilateral agreements. But in the absence of having agreements and knowing exactly who will do what in an emergency, it leaves a lot of uncertainty and concern in First Nations communities. So I think that the Indigenous Services Canada really needs to rethink how they're approaching this. They're doing a lot of engagement with First Nations communities, but really trying to do the old engagement and come out with a different outcome. And I think it's time they rethink how they approach stuff.
And yeah, similarly, you found that there hadn't been any progress on the recommendation to create provincially and federally agreed upon evacuation service standards. I think you noted that there is one agreement with Ontario, but that's been there for a while, and that's all we currently have. Like, how important is that recommendation in the context of some of the other red flags you've raised here in the emergency management side?
Well, I think when I look at our report where on the follow-up on First Nations programs, we looked at programs that I think that cover services that most Canadians take for granted. So having access to safe drinking water, having access to healthcare and nurses, or knowing that emergency services will respond in a crisis. So I think all of the recommendations that have unsatisfactory progress are concerning. It's important to have these agreements before an emergency happens so that if the First Nations community decides that they are unable to respond, they know exactly who to turn to, what to expect, when to expect it, and then they can iron out, who pays for what afterwards. But you need to know who's going to do what in a crisis, and in the middle of it isn't time to figure that out.
Frédéric Pepin.
Frédéric Pépin, Radio-Canada. Hello, Ms. Hogan. In your report on the Canadian Armed Forces recruitment, that there are very few who succeed in passing the exam. Do you believe that the armed forces should review their criteria so that more candidates make it to the end of the process? Answer. It's not that there's a lack of interest in joining the Canadian Armed Forces. Only 1 in 13 of these candidates make it to basic training. People leave during basic training and leave after. But if we look at the recruitment process itself, over 54% of individuals gave up on the process. National Defense does not know why. And so they are unable to say whether it is because of delays. Some might say that the recruitment process should last 150 days and no more than 250 days. That could be one of the causes that explains why people give up. If you have to wait for a job, you'll leave and try to find something else. But the other causes we're not aware of. Some people mentioned having access to affordable housing was a concern. And so there is a link between the two reports. But this is something that the Canadian Armed Forces need to focus on. You can't change if you don't know why people aren't making it to basic training. You talked about affordable housing now. When we look at the armed forces members who have access to housing, and in your report, it's about 27% of armed forces members. So that means that the others own their own homes. Should the federal government abandon the idea of having housing that is managed by the armed forces and leaving it to the private sector or to the CMHC? Answer. You are correct. Most members own housing or rent. Sometimes it depends on quarters. If we're talking about basic recruitment, instead of living in a house, it's like university. You might be sharing a room, or you might be in a big building with other members. So there are reasons for having quarters. National Defense is very good in responding for a crisis, but not so much in managing housing. And they need to see the urgency in managing their housing or find solutions that will better help them support Canadian Armed Forces members.
No post.
Good afternoon. As you know, there's been a fair amount of money poured into the CRA for their call centers, including in 2022, which was interesting. In the fall economic statement, the government promised $400 million for them to sustain and maintain the service standard levels of basically the only year where they actually hit them. And as you also know, the numbers then dropped, their service standards, but also the number of employees. So I'm curious, do you know what happened to that $400 million? Was it never spent, or was it just not spent effectively enough and the service standards dropped?
That's such a specific question. I couldn't tell you where that $400 million went. But what I can tell you is that I think funds are needed to invest in the tools. I think there are Canadians who would prefer the self-service option, would be really happy dealing with the chatbot or just doing it on their own through my account. And then there are others who really want to talk to an agent. So you need to be able to improve the services in both areas. But as I mentioned previously, I think it's a bit of the culture of prioritizing a call volume and adherence to a schedule instead of really prioritizing quality and completeness of answers. And just that would have an impact once you get to an agent getting a more accurate response.
And in terms of the 100-day recovery plan, which, service improvement plan, which you may have seen, CRA has already talked about having put more employees in the call centers. But are you worried that they're essentially going to just pivot existing staff into them to the detriment of other services? Or have you heard of a proper plan to either staff it up again at the call center or really tangibly improve those services, but not to the detriment of other sections of CRA?
So I haven't talked to the Canada Revenue Agency about their 100-day plan. It was released after the end of our audit period. I have looked at it to see what's in it, and I think in combination with their responses to our recommendations, there should be some improvement. But it's not just agents that are going to improve this. It's also about the tools that are used and making sure that everyone can access them faster. When you can get better information from publicly available artificial intelligence, I think it's not a far stretch to improve access to information for agents so that they can respond quicker and then handle more calls, but at least respond with accurate answers.
Alex Bollingal at Toronto Star, please.
Going back to the military housing, the places that you guys found with the crumbling walls and the toilets that weren't working and the unsafe water, were those places where soldiers are currently housed, or were they buildings for housing that are in such a state of disrepair that they're kind of sitting there empty?
In many cases, they were buildings where people are housed.
Okay.
So that's why I said it's the kind of conditions you and I wouldn't want to live in, and the kind of conditions I don't think we should let our Canadian Armed Forces live in. There are 32 buildings, so I'm sure some of them are probably abandoned, but if they were houses, we saw buildings where people were still being housed.
Okay. And on the childcare report, talking about the number of spaces and the risk of not creating as many as they want to, what about the goal of $10 a day? Is that on track, or is that at risk of not being met, bringing the average down to $10 a day? And is there enough, I guess, funding in the system to achieve that by 2026, I think was the goal?
Yeah, so the goal was to achieve $10 a day for every province and territory by the end of March 2026. Right now, at the end of 2024, there were 5 provinces and 3 territories who are already at $10 a day. That being said, 2 of them were already at $10 before all of this started. I think they're well on track, but what we heard from the provinces was that they're concerned about the fiscal sustainability of this beyond 2026. When you lower costs, you have a trade-off in that you create a better increased demand, and then the increased demand has a ripple effect. You need more trained childcare providers, you need facilities, and so long term, there's something that the federal government needs to work with the provinces and territories to figure out.
Steph Levitz, Globe and Mail.
Hi there. Thank you for taking our question. Just to go back to something you said to my colleague earlier about the audits of the military in the context of the $9 billion we're investing in defense. You made the observation that the defense is operating off of outdated data. So does that then undercut the plans and promises they're making now? Like, are they setting themselves up for failure because they're promising things on old data? They've made these policy ideas off old data. So how can they possibly do what they say they're going to do?
Well, I was referring to the fact that when we looked at fighter jets, they started that off with outdated data, and as a result, right now it's estimated that the jets will cost more than originally planned. When you look at the housing units, there is currently a plan to build housing units, but it's not enough to meet the existing demand, and doesn't factor in the fact that National Defense would like to increase recruitment. When we did look at that plan, we felt that was based on their needs assessment from 2019. It included salary information from 2019 and then market data from 2011. There's a lot more recent information that you could use to make a more robust plan and then have a better idea of how much you need to spend in order to renovate or build housing.
So then I guess, is the public then not supposed to believe any of their promises now if we know that they're based on outdated data?
I think they were already moving at updating their plan. They currently received about $2.2 billion to build units and renovate units, but it's over a period of 19 years. So it's impossible for me to tell you whether or not that plan's going to be successful. It's got a really long tail and it just began.
Rémi, CPAC.
Rémi from CPAC.
Bonjour. Concernant
Hello. Regarding your follow-up on programs for First Nations, you noted that that spending increased by 84% with very little progress, and you mentioned the CRA and having more people and increasing services. But in this case, they increased personnel without improving services. Answer: I think that we can see that funding is not the only thing important in making improvements. We raised 4 challenges. They are not the only challenges, but they are significant, and I want to mention 2 of them. The lack of attention is problematic. There's a lot of activity after we publish a report. There's an action plan that is shared, but then over time, there's less focus. Sometimes it's because of political changes, priorities are reorganized, but there needs to be an ongoing focus in order to see improvements to programs. The last thing I would mention is that ISC often works in silos. Each program for Indigenous services is seen separately, and if there are funding programs, they might be even more done in silos. And so it increases the disparity rather, and they cannot manage the different programs. Question: regarding early learning and childcare, you mentioned that there's a risk, even though new spaces were created and the funding is there, there's a risk that these spaces will not be accessible equally. Now, given the different jurisdictions and that provinces have their word to say, can the federal government truly orient the funding in order to meet the various needs? Answer: when the federal government worked on this plan with the provinces and territories, they decided that affordability, access, inclusion would be essential elements to the program, and funding was targeted for those different priorities. We've noted that all provinces have an agreement that meet their needs. They have the flexibility to spend the funds as they see fit, but it's the information that is shared after that with the federal government that leaves ESDC incapable of seeing whether or not the situation has improved, if it's truly inclusive. They have data on new spaces, but the definition of inclusive new spaces varies. And so we don't know if these spaces were taken up by the families who were targeted.
I'm sorry, I haven't met you yet, but please go ahead.
Hi, I'm Marlo Glass with the Hill Times. Why is it that CRA agents are giving this incorrect information so frequently?
That's an excellent question to ask Canada Revenue Agency. I would expect that they are perhaps not getting enough training. We saw that as one of our findings. There was a lot of quality review of calls. They did so many this year compared to previous years, but yet there was very little actionable feedback or recommendations coming from this quality review. And as a result, we saw very little training or coaching of agents. So that could be a reason. I do believe that our recommendation about triaging the calls, right, taking this real technical I have an issue getting into my account. Maybe it's my web browser. What is it? From help me understand parts of the Income Tax Act are two different skill sets and two different training. And if you triage that and redirected the calls to agents with the right skill sets, you would hopefully improve the accuracy.
Turning now to Charlie the chat bot, why is it so inaccurate compared to its AI peers?
Charlie was populated solely with information around personal income taxes. And when we went to Charlie, we asked in the areas of benefits, in business taxes, as well as personal taxes. So that could be part of the reason. But 2 out of 6 means Charlie got it right 33% of the time. That's a little more accurate than reaching an agent and asking them a question about your personal taxes. So I think it just highlights that there's a lot of room for improvement.
Jim Bronskill, Canadian Press.
On cybersecurity, some of the Crown agencies you spoke to said they rejected federal services protection because it might compromise their independence. What do you think of that rationale?
Here we're talking about the network-based defense sensors that are available to anyone in the federal family. It is not the only cyber defense tool. It should be a tool that you layer on top of your existing cyber defenses. These defenses are actually proven and solid. They're actually used by other countries because they're effective. We were told 3 things. One is that it might compromise independence. So, for example, if you were a Crown corporation, using a service provided by the core government might have an impact on your independence. That there was limited ability to customize these tools, but also that there were concerns around the level of support and maintenance that would be provided by shared services. What I would tell you is that I am an independent agent of Parliament. I should be one of the most independent organizations in the federal public service, and I have good cyber defenses. But I use these cyber defense sensors over and above them because I think that everyone expects I will do everything you possibly can to protect the information that's entrusted to us, as Canadians should expect everyone in the federal government will do everything they can. And this is just another layer of defense.
Is there anybody else who has a question that I haven't already called on yet? Michelle Saba?
Michelle Saba.
Mylène Cret? Who's next to you? Mylène, go ahead.
Mylène Cret. In the report on cybersecurity, which department was targeted by a cyber attack and took 7 days to respond? Answer, it wasn't 7 days. It was in January 2024. I can think of the English acronym. Global Affairs Canada was the target. Thank you.
Vous mentionnez justement
You mentioned recruitment issues at the Canadian Armed Forces, but also regarding training. There will be an increase in pay. So what kind of pressures could recruitment face when they're already struggling to recruit new members? I think you're talking about increasing recruitment. Before increasing recruitment, they need to understand why people are giving up. We've noticed that their ability to train people at basic training was insufficient if they had met their targets. Over the last year, they recruited more than their targets, and they needed to hire more trainers part-time, but the Canadian Armed Forces stated that that wasn't a long-term solution. It was not sustainable. And so they need to look at the causes as to why people are giving up on the process, but they also need to improve their capacity, better equipment, more trainers, and more capacity.
The Canadian Press.
Thank you for taking my question. This report mentions a significant jump in CRA call wait times and information inaccuracy 2024 fiscal year compared to the last. Do you think this is a resource issue at the core of the problem, or do you think this is more of a management issue at the CRA?
I would think it's a combination of a few of our findings. Obviously, the number of agents impacts wait times and service. I think that the tools that are used by those agents means you're spending longer on the call with an agent if they're not more efficient at doing their job. I would tell you that the focus on really following a schedule, so ending a call quickly because your schedule dictates, is probably driving some of the quality of the answers that are being received. I mean, there's many things, and it's not just about people here.
And what do you think the most urgent fix that Canadians should see for the next year regarding this CRA issue?
I'm sorry. What do I think?
What do you think the most urgent fix should be that Canadians should hope to see for next year?
Well, I would think that even if you have to wait, when you get through, you should get an accurate response, especially as I mentioned, when the onus is on you to file your tax return and have it be accurate, or you will be reassessed. So I think that the expectation should be that the accuracy of responses and the completeness of responses absolutely improves.
Okay, the gentleman at the back next to Milan. Yes.
So with the long-term drinking water advisories on First Nations, obviously the federal government had committed to that and not met it, but it seems they've abandoned that, and at the same time they are pursuing legislation, or they plan to reintroduce legislation that puts in place some of the sort of structural framework that you mentioned would be necessary to achieving the elimination of these long-term drinking water advisories. So do you think it's reasonable for them to abandon that now and sort of set the frame, put the structure in place rather than committing to eliminating all these drinking water advisories at the present moment?
Well, I think a regulatory regime, which is still missing, is absolutely essential. First Nations communities don't have a base or anything to insist on what the minimum expectation is, where around the country, everyone else absolutely does. So this just reinforces disparities until you get that regulatory regime in place. I would imagine the 9 communities that have been on a long-term drinking water advisory now for over a decade, each of them probably has very unique and complex situation to try to address that. And I think that some of the barriers that we identified about just doing the same approach to try and resolve these issues is not working. And I really hope that the government will take this report and tackle those 4 barriers and think about a new way to deal with some of the issues. So when I get to the end of my 10 years, I'm not here telling you there are still many communities with long-term drinking water advisories.
Follow up? No. Okay, we're going to take a question over Zoom to Auditor General, if you don't mind. Palak Mangat at Parliament Today. The floor is yours, please.
Hi, on the cybersecurity report, you note that Shared Services Canada essentially shelved its plans for the SIEM, Security Info and Event Management Project, last year in June, obviously pending approval of more funding. We know that the agency wants to move ahead with this and submit kind of a new funding proposal by December, but just in the context of the government looking to rein in spending, are you worried that requests like this one could fall flat?
Well, this isn't the first time that I have talked about the need to invest in things you just don't see. We talked about that during the pandemic, about maintaining what's in the National Emergency Strategic Stockpile. And I think you could talk about that when you talk about any IT system. You need to have the right tools to be able to support you in delivering on a mandate. And here, this tool was meant to give a global picture of vulnerabilities and potential attacks across the federal government. I think any good cyber defense system needs everybody to participate. Many people at work will know that they're being told you should report when you get a phishing email, because the more people who report that, the more you can bolster defenses. And I think we do have to find the ability to invest in IT systems that will help bolster the cybersecurity of networks and systems across the federal government.
And kind of on that point, you've in the report you've also talked about a lack of take up from federal entities to these to the two agency services, but I don't think you recommend mandating them. So can you clarify what your thoughts are on making that a requirement? And is that something you talked about? And what was the reaction?
So that's entirely a policy question, and I don't comment on policy. I comment on the implementation of those policies. Right now, only 85 organizations across the federal public service are required to use these sensors. That being said, many who aren't have adopted some of them. I'm just highlighting the gap that creates in the cyber infrastructure and defenses across the public service. It's now up to the public service and parliamentarians to act on that.
Okay. There's a couple more folks on the Zoom. If you have a question, now's your chance to raise your hand. Okay. If not, I'm just going to ask a quick question from the moderator's chair, if you don't mind. How would you characterize the CRA's accuracy?
As inaccurate. If you're calling about if you're calling about general tax questions, but if you're calling because you need help with my account, you will get an accurate response.
All right, that concludes today's press conference. Thank you all. Thank you to the Auditor General. We genuinely appreciate you making so much time for us and our questions. Have a good day, everyone.
Recording stopped.